Every single evil thing that you could do to another human being, he's probably done them. A terrifying serial killer that you've likely never heard of, Richard Chase, also known as the Dracula Killer or the Vampire of Sacramento. It's October, it's spooky season. All month, you guys have been begging me to cover the most terrifying true crime cases I know, and all I can say is be careful what you ask for, because the crimes that this man committed are some of the most gruesome, horrific, and brutal that we have ever covered. This is not the video that you guys are going to want to eat during while you watch. So we don't know too much about Richard's childhood. He was in Boy Scouts, he did Little League, and honestly things seemed pretty normal until he was around 10 years old, when he began to torture and kill animals. As a teenager, Richard began to experiment with mind-altering substances, but he still seemed and looked like a normal dude. He had friends, he had a couple girlfriends, but he wasn't able to keep any of these relationships going for very long because Richard had trouble performing in the bedroom. As Richard went from a teenager into his early adult life, he thought that maybe he couldn't get it up because he didn't have enough blood in his body, so he actually began to drink the blood from little bunny rabbits that he stole and killed from a bunny farm near his house. These were definitely like the first really major red flags that there was something wrong with Richard, that he was suffering with some kind of mental illness, and this was the beginning of Richard's rapid declining mental health. So every single day, Richard was drinking the blood of bunnies. He was eating them raw. He was also using a blender to make smoothies made from bunny organs and Coca-Cola. At 25 years old, Richard was actually hospitalized because he had a blood infection, because he was actually injecting himself with rabbit blood, because at this time he actually convinced himself that he needed this blood to live and it was healing him. Because at this time he was like a hypochondriac, he was very paranoid and very anxious. He thought that he didn't have enough blood in his body, that his heart was not beating sometimes, that his stomach was upside down, and these are just to name a few of the things that he thought. He also believed that the bones in his skull were moving around, or more bones were just growing out the back of his head. And he believed that all these things could be healed if he just drank blood. I also read this and I thought that this was just kind of silly. Richard did not think that he was getting enough vitamin C, so he would just walk around with like an orange, like the fruit, on his head because he thought that the vitamin C would absorb into his brain. He's clearly just completely unhinged. So Richard was involuntarily committed to a psychiatric hospital. At the hospital, Richard was stealing the blood from therapy dogs. He would also open up windows, hang out the windows so he could rip birds that were flying in the sky, like rip them out of the sky, and then he would rip them open with his bare hands so he could drink the blood of these birds. I guess the staff at the hospital thought this was really amusing because they nicknamed Richard Dracula. So despite all of this really concerning behavior, Richard was only at this hospital for 5 months before the hospital released him. Some staff at the hospital were really adamant against Richard's release because they thought that Richard was a danger to himself and others, and obviously they were really right. Also at this time, Richard was just like not taking care of himself at all. Like he used to be like conventionally attractive, and then he just like stopped any kind of hygiene, stopped brushing his teeth or showering. And pretty much as soon as Richard was released, he escalated from torturing, killing, drinking, eating bunnies to the dogs and cats of his own neighbors. And if he was unable to steal one of his neighbor's pets and he felt like he needed to because the bones in his head were moving, he would just go buy a dog or a cat. And there was one time where he actually bought 2 puppies to do these horrific things to. He was actually so out of his mind that there was this one point where he actually called one of his neighbors to let them know that he had just stolen their dog out of their backyard and he had, like ate and drank it already. There was also one point that Richard brought a cat to his mother's house. When his mother opened the front door, he dropped the cat in front of her and then ripped it open with his bare hands. And no one is reporting all these like really unhinged things that this clearly sick man is doing. Like at one point he got caught by police driving around in a car that was completely covered in blood on the inside and the outside, and they just released him after they found out that the blood was just that of animals. Because no one was reporting the unhinged things that Richard was doing, he was also able to buy firearms. And Richard was using these firearms without a care in the world, just open fire while he's driving by in drive-by shootings. And this is actually how Richard took his first known victim, who was a husband and father of two named Ambrose Griffin, and he was just helping his wife take in groceries when Richard just drove by and shot him. It's also around this time that Richard began to escalate again, and he began to break into just people's houses, not to rob them, just purely to scare them. But Richard would only break into people's houses if the door was unlocked, because he thought that that was like an invitation that he was allowed in, and if the door was locked, that meant he was not welcome. So this is your reminder to go make sure that your doors are locked right now. This is how Richard broke into the home of David and Teresa Wallen. So David was actually supposed to be home, but he was late getting home from work because his car had broken down on the way home, leaving his wife Teresa, who was 3 months pregnant at the time, home alone when Richard walked in. Richard shot Teresa 3 times, which unalived her instantly. He then dragged her body into the bedroom where he essayed her body. Richard then began to dissect her, doing experiments on her and her unborn child, drinking her blood, bathing in her blood, just entirely horrific, brutal scene. And then when he was done, he just left her body there for her husband to come home and find. It was less than 1 week later, Richard broke into the home of Evelyn Miriff through her unlocked back door. At the time, Evelyn was home with her 6-year-old son, Jason, her 22-month-old nephew, David, and also her neighbor, Dan Meredith. Richard shot and killed all 4 of them in the home. He did the same horrific, brutal things to Evelyn's body that he had done to Teresa's body. He then fled the home with the body of the 22-month-old David. Back in his apartment, he did awful, disgusting things to the body of the 22-month-old infant before dumping David's partial remains in a cardboard box near a church, like the baby was trash. So the investigators were luckily able to find out that the same firearm was being used at all of these crimes, even these drive-by shootings. The FBI got involved, like the BAU from like Criminal Minds. They were able to put out a profile of the man that they were looking for, and it worked. They started getting tips that, you know, you might want to be looking into Richard Chase, this unhinged man who's eating his neighbor's pets and driving around in a car full of blood. When Richard was arrested at his apartment, the apartment was just completely disgusting, just foul. There was blood and body parts in every single room. Every single part of the kitchen had blood on it. Like every eating utensil, we're talking like spoons, forks, bowls, plates, everything had blood on it. Of course, they found his blender that he used to make smoothies, which apparently he never washed once. Like I would actually get sick if I was an officer at this scene. The sicko also in his kitchen had a pile of pet collars from the pets of his neighbors that he stole and ate. Somehow Richard was found competent to stand trial, and while at his trial he tried to plead not guilty by reason of insanity, which I honestly feel like could have worked. I feel like this man is very much out of his mind, but he was found guilty and he was sentenced to the death penalty, but not long later he actually ended up unaliving himself behind bars. If you watched this video, thank you so much. You are a brave one. I'm actually really surprised that this case isn't more well known, that more people don't know about Richard Case, but maybe it's because it's too disgusting to learn about. Let me know all your thoughts and opinions in the comments. While you're there, please let me know what case you want to see me cover next. But until then, I love you guys so much, and I will see you guys tomorrow with yet another crazy case.